Hello, everyone. I'm Sheila Harris, and I'm the International President of LAI. And I want to welcome you today to our special webinar on spatial inequalities. We're really looking forward to hearing from not only one of our LEF research recipients, but a member of LAI. We're finding that some of our LEF recipients are starting to join our wonderful organization. And Velma, our speaker today, started as a member in Atlanta, but has now moved to Memphis and is transferring her membership there. So this is just one of the number of benefits that are available to our members, both in LEF and LAI. At this point in time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Richard Cook from Vancouver, and he's going to introduce our speaker. This is going to be a really exciting program. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Sheila. It's my pleasure. My name is Richard Cook. For those of you who have not met me, I'm the chair of the ad hoc programming committee that was set up early on in the COVID times, and we've been having a number of wonderful webinars, and we're looking forward today to hearing from Professor Zahirovic-Herbert about her work on sustainable real estate. She is the Martha and Robert Fogelman Family Chair in Sustainable Real Estate and a professor of real estate at the University of Memphis. And her research has focused on housing markets, neighborhood change and growth, applications of consumer behavior theories to real estate brokerage. She's published extensively. She's a managing editor of the Journal of Housing Research and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of European Real Estate Research, among other things. And she's an active member of the American Real Estate Society, where she co-chairs the Women's Caucus Group. Not only that, but she's, I think, the newest member of the LAI Memphis chapter, and we're very excited about having her continue to do her work with LAI there. She's going to speak today about her project that has been funded by the Land Economics Foundation with her colleague, Richard Dunning. Velma, welcome to the presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you and having some time after your talk to ask some questions.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, Sheila, and everybody else for attending today's talk. I want to take the opportunity and thank the Lambda Alpha International Group for welcoming me to their chapter in Atlanta and Memphis now as well. And I would like to thank the Land Economics Foundation for extending their financial support for this project. It was such a nice introduction, so I don't have a lot to add, but perhaps tell you a little bit about what my research portfolio looks like, the type of studies that I examine, and then kind of go over what my co-author and I did in the project that was funded by LEF, as well as the University of Liverpool and University of Georgia. And unfortunately, our work was interrupted with the arrival of the pandemic. So in my talk, I want to emphasize some of the tangencies or future directions that grew out of this project. So as Richard pointed out, I'm a professor of real estate and I am a housing economist as well. I mostly focus on residential real estate markets, and so I look at the topics that concern urban land use and residential developments. I look at neighborhood externalities and whether those can be seen as a positive or negative externalities and how they impact surrounding property prices. And then I focus on implementing consumer behavior theories. And I do believe to a great degree that real estate markets are consumer markets. And I introduce these theories to study real estate agency and household finance. The work I'm presenting today is done in collaboration with my co-author and colleague, Dr. Dang of University of Liverpool. And while Richard and I have a lot of research interests in common, he is a lot more looking at the topics from the planning perspective. So Richard has done a lot of work on calculating housing needs, and then the relationships of the public outcomes and land value capture, different mechanisms of land value capture. And recently he has focused on cycling infrastructure. So our research skills really complement each other very well. And so we have capitalized on that to work together on some of the projects. The topic of my talk today is land value capture, or as we title it, is there a value to capture and how is it captured? And then I really want to emphasize some of the extension of that work that were done as a result of the pandemic. For those of you who are not super familiar with the concept, and I doubt that there are many people who have not heard of the concept, land value capture basically enables communities to recover and hopefully reinvest the land value increases that oftentimes result from either public investments or public policy and several other types of government actions. The main concept here that the land value capture is rooted in the notion that public should benefit from those actions that are taken by public. In essence, if the landowners are not the ones making improvements to the land, but rather if those improvements are funded by the public sources, then the public should receive those benefits. Richard and I were interested in this type of concept for a while now. Mostly when we would get together, we would talk about different mechanisms, and those mechanisms can really be placed in 6 different larger categories. And I listed here some of those because you might be familiar with some of these tools and not necessarily all of them. But we were curious about how different mechanisms are used, how they're selected by most important stakeholders in the process, and what are the potential consequences, or if you want to say side effects, of choosing different mechanisms. So to do that, we approached Land Economics Foundation, and they were very generous to fund the research, as well as the University of Georgia, which was an institution I was with for 15 years prior to joining the University of Memphis, and the University of Liverpool. So we received the funding to look into what we called global approaches to land value capture. And for us, really, the idea was that we wanted to contrast the stakeholder attitudes and their behavior towards this existing mechanism in their localities and ask them about alternatives or hypothetical mechanisms that they could use. We proposed to do this project in 3 comparative case studies. One of them was Tax Allocation District in Atlanta BeltLine in USA. And this would be found under tax increment financing in terms of the land value capture mechanisms. In Atlanta, it's called actually Tax Allocation District. And then we wanted to compare that to integrated development of the rail transit in China and planning obligations with this community infrastructure levy that was around a train station in London. By the way, all of the images that I'm using in this presentation are from the BeltLine.org website. So I want to make sure I give them credit, although I do not carry that link through all of my slides. But the idea was that we would, rather than do theoretical studies of how the mechanism works, that we would actually focus on talking to stakeholders and members of the community and asking for their interpretation of what these mechanisms are. So we received the funding in the summer of 2019. We arranged for a visit for Dr. Danning to Atlanta, and he arrived in the fall of 2018. The members of the local chapter in Atlanta, including Holly Elmore, helped us organize meetings with the stakeholders in the community. And I have to say that this was a wonderful collaboration between researchers receiving funding through the foundation and working with the local members of Lambda Alpha International. Couple of members or local community stakeholders that we met were actually themselves members of Lambda Alpha International Atlanta chapter. So our meetings were organized. It was just a really good way to manage the partnerships and the relationships. And so what we did is when Richard arrived, we met with stakeholders in the Atlanta community and got a big picture of what the project is all about and how it was financed, which was the main question for us. I think if you were able to join the call or the webinar a couple of weeks ago or months ago, one of the topics that LAI discussed was the BeltLine in Baltimore, and I believe they actually mentioned the BeltLine project in Atlanta itself. The BeltLine project is a greenway walking trail that connects the neighborhoods, but in Atlanta it was based on recycling or reusing the areas where the railroad tracks were set up around the city. So Atlanta is known for its railroad legacy and was actually a really interesting way to incorporate using the space that has been vacant and abandoned for a long time. So some of the images are here to just show you what the difference the project has made since, and there's a lot of evidence on the change it has made. In general, Atlanta needed a project like this. Atlanta was underparked city. Only 4% of the city was had green spaces. And if we want to compare that to some of the other southern cities or southern comparable cities, Austin was twice that much. The idea was that this program, this BeltLine corridor will establish a number of different facilities, including the green spaces and parks. The plan included 22 miles along the railroad tracks and then additional mileage that would make connecting trails to the area. The plan was that this development will, and it still is, connect 45 different neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods will be then connected with light rail as well as walking, biking, or cycling trails. I want to make sure I'm rushing through the intro because I think what's more interesting is really the findings we have and how we move forward with those findings. But it's difficult to talk about that before giving some kind of overview. Apologies if I'm going too fast, but the project is funded through the Tax Allocation District in part. This is the main source of funding. Other fundings came from philanthropic donations and private-public partnerships. The TAD was adopted in 2005, and it was agreed upon by the city, county, and public schools. The idea is that as the new development happens, this will increase the property values, which will increase the tax revenue generated. And then the additional component of this increase in tax revenue will revert back to pay for the future investments in the BeltLine. After 25 years, the project is scheduled to be complete by 2030, that city, county, and public schools will receive all of the tax revenues. So it's a typical land value capture mechanism based on tax increment financing. As the project rolled out, several concerns were brought up to light, and they were extensively covered in popular press. So I just put a little link here to some of the articles that you would see in magazines like Curved Atlanta, like Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and others. The main concern was that there will be an impact on property values in low-income neighborhoods that have already started experiencing gentrification. The Atlanta BeltLine project worked hard to address some of these concerns, and they have created the organizations such as Affordable Housing Trust Fund to help mitigate some of the public's concerns. Commitment that they've made was that there would be 5,600 units dedicated to affordable housing built along the corridor. Unfortunately, Atlanta BeltLine former CEO, director of the program, has, I believe, graded himself as a C for delivering on this project. And there was a lot of controversy about whether the project was able to deliver what they had promised. So, but just as an illustration of how large of a scale this project was, the half-a-mile corridor on either side of the Beltline, we've seen 88 developments that have been either completed or still in the progress, and those developments so far have added over 12,000 new units. Less than 2,000 of those new residential units have been for affordable housing. So clearly there was a reason for concern. So when we started this project, Dr. Danning, Richard, and I decided that we wanted to address several questions, or we wanted our interviews with the local participants to address several questions. The main questions were really, for whom will the public sector be recovering economic value created? From who will we be seeing paying for these tax increases? And in part, the question came out of our concern that many neighborhoods, in particular on the south side of Atlanta, where the Beltline development is occurring, were low-income neighborhoods. There were no provisions in the original plan to address increases property taxes for low-income homeowners in the area and how those tax burdens would be handled by the community. To whom will the economic value be likely to accrue over being recovered or distributed? We wondered, what is the relationship of the value recovery mechanism to the overall taxation and the budget process? We also wanted to talk about who bears the financial risks, and if there are any financial risks, because oftentimes the projects are funded today with the hope that some of the revenues will be recovered in future. And the Beltline started before, a couple of years before the housing market crash. And so there were some uncertainties with how that type of crash or potential subsequent crashes would impact the process. And finally, we wanted to know who is involved in governing these kind of value recoveries and allocations, and how these answers to these questions differ among different projects we examined. So here is what we found from the project in Atlanta specifically. The stakeholders during our visits with them indicated that one of the biggest issues was that the neighborhoods that Atlanta Beltline included, in particular the east side of Atlanta Beltline, were already gentrifying. And so taking away these property, additional increases in property value due to property taxes was really taking away the money from public schools. The two other larger concerns that were brought up regularly were the idea of lack of transparency among community members, or community members in those areas did not really understand the process. And generally, there was a sense of illiteracy about the land value capture mechanisms. Again, people in the community didn't quite understand how the process works. And some of the other concerns were about the limits on property taxations in these jurisdictions. And another one was that there was no provisions for potential increases in rental prices around the Beltline, as well as what the difference between this randomly decided buffer of a half a mile around the Beltline would mean for the development just outside of the buffer. Would there be more of a speculative development just outside of the buffer? And so we were able to summarize the effects of the program in Atlanta. Unfortunately, as Richard concluded his visit and we concluded transcribing these interviews, the pandemic arrived, the early spring 2020, right? And my visit to Liverpool was no longer possible. So what we did was figure out what else could we do with this research. Both University of Georgia and the University of Liverpool stopped human subject research. Even though meetings via Zoom were possible, I think the universities had to have a unique across the board policy about human subject research at the time, and so that was stopped. But the way the budgets work in the public institutions, we had to proceed with spending the money allocated for the program. So what we did is we actually put a group together with the help of both University of Georgia and University of Liverpool and organized a virtual symposium on spatial inequalities. And our focus of that symposium was to bring a group of people together that would address spatial inequalities in a broader concept, not just look at it spatially. So we wanted to see how are these spatial inequalities evolving, what are some of the determinants of spatial inequalities and not just space itself, and what are the possible implications for the policy. So this was a symposium held over 3 days. It gathered people from different departments of both universities, from School of Pharmacy to Ag Econ departments, management, public health. And it was a really interesting gathering of exchange of ideas on what creates, what are the determinants of spatial inequalities and how they could be addressed, especially in the context of large urban redevelopments. Of course, because this was at the time of COVID's impact, most of the talk was really around the disadvantages the minority communities face. And we didn't stop there. So both Richard and I extended our research further. So so we had to transition from human subject research to what we call desk-based research, basically using publicly available data sources or maybe proprietary data, but one that allows us to do work sitting at our desk. And so Richard focused on the concept of 20-minute neighborhood, which I think is a bit different from 50-minute city concept that probably started in the Pacific Coast, I believe. So he looked at distribution of 20-minute neighborhoods with the idea that a person who lives in one location should be able to go 10 minutes in either direction and have a neighborhood with the access to amenities, services, and opportunities. And so he used the concept that was really based or was motivation was coming from Atlanta's BeltLine idea that the BeltLine will connect 45 different neighborhoods, yet provide a way to make the connection for residents living in those neighborhoods. And so the image here is really showing just the inequality in the provision of services in Liverpool. I think it was interesting for him to really see. So you will see the orange marked here neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that have high access to services within the 20-minute boundary of walkable neighborhood in each direction. And the blue ones are the neighborhoods that have a very low access. And so it was kind of interesting to see that this spatial inequality concept is not unique to the United States or Southeast area, because for us, that was the emphasis in Georgia. My research took a bit of a different direction. So what I decided to look at is think about, we already had a lot written about BeltLine. Dr. Dan Immergluck is a researcher at the Georgia State University, their urban center, and he has done a lot of analyses on the impact of the BeltLine on surrounding neighborhoods. So in his studies from 2018, I believe, he found that property within half a mile of the BeltLine has experienced anywhere between 17 or 18 to 27% increase in property values due to the proximity to the BeltLine. And I think he emphasized the east side of Atlanta, the portion of the BeltLine that was already developed. And so we already had some sense of the magnitude of change in property values due to the BeltLine specifically. So I was actually interested in identifying a similar type of public investment, if you want, policies that could create land value capture results. So what I did look at was the film tax credit in Georgia. Georgia is, or Atlanta specifically, has become, I think, the #1 in the United States for film, movie, TV series production site. And so I wanted to see whether this type of program creates similar changes in property values, and if it could be considered as another mechanism by which we could capture land value increases. And just a brief overview of some of the changes that we have seen in Atlanta with the movie studios coming in. Tyler Perry being one of the more well-known studios, and he has taken space on the west side of the city in the former military base, not very far from the BeltLine. And I actually want to point out that for those members from Atlanta area who are joining the call today, Atlanta chapter is holding a meeting about economic development around the BeltLine that will be in a brewery on the west side of the BeltLine, very close to the Tyler Perry Studios, I think at the end of September. So hopefully you can join and view the effects of this type of development. But other studios in the area, large studios, have started developing their own cities that are actually neighborhoods, probably emphasizing the needs of the labor force that will be employed or is employed in the movie studios, and their need to live close to their employment centers. So I started looking at whether this Georgia Industries Film Investment Act that provides 20% tax credit for property for companies who film in Atlanta is translating into any gains into property values. The image here is actually Georgia Power was very generous in sharing their data with me. And they had data on production studios, so I could get the location of each of the production studio, map that, and then look at the property in the surrounding area of the studios. So what I did focus on is, if you will notice, this is Atlanta, for those of you who are not super familiar, 285. Most of the inner city neighborhoods, of course, are inside that perimeter. So I focused on the studios that were relatively close to the city and did not look at the ones at the exurbs that would be a very different type of housing market segment. So I looked at 15 studios specifically. I started with like over 1 million observations of housing sales over the last 10 years, and then narrowed that down until I got to the number of houses that were sold before and after the film production studio opens. And then I also was able to look specifically at these large studios that require a lot of space for their production, because it might not be very clear whether those facilities are seen as amenities or disamenities. In some sense, as amenities, maybe they clean up what used to be a vacant site or abandoned site. At the same time, they could be creating additional noise pollution, traffic, and oftentimes they have this industrial type of look. So it wasn't really clear if the neighbors would find the location next to those type of facilities positive or a negative thing. What I found was that film production studios were by default locating or were located in a lower property value neighborhoods. So you want to say maybe cheaper neighborhoods. However, the establishment of the studio was actually seen as a positive event. So similar to BeltLine in a sense, BeltLine connected a lot of low-income neighborhoods that were already kind of with distressed housing and a lot of abandoned vacant property, but the BeltLine itself served as a positive event and led or contributed towards gentrification of those neighborhoods. I find out that the same is true for the movie studios. As I said, I emphasized the impact between smaller and larger studios, and I find that larger studios not only decreased the discount we have seen in these neighborhoods prior to studio openings, but they actually led to a change in the trend in house prices. So we saw a positive impact of these studios on house prices within 1 mile of the large studios. We also saw that these house price trend, although the houses have been increasing in value overall for the Atlanta in the last 10 years, the houses that were closer to studios, those increases in house values were higher above the trend for the general area. So we contributed those increases to the film production studio. So we were able to really see that there is going to be an increase in the increase in property values. And the question is whether something like this can also be used to implement the value capture to try to get some of that revenues. One caveat for this research is that this is a relatively recent development in Atlanta. So we do not have really enough data to consider a long-term effects to the housing market from this type of, should we say, clean industry. I think if I just look at some of the newer announcements, I think it will be interesting to see how the developers react and whether they not only, whether these film studios not only create increases in the existing value of the existing housing stock, but if the development actually itself changes in a way that brings more expensive housing to this area. So housing stock changes as well. So to summarize, while we started looking at land value capture directed to 3 different projects in across the world, due to the pandemic, our efforts changed and we converted our research from human subject-based to really desk-based research, looking at similar concepts that emphasize the need to understand the implications of large-scale development projects. So I think I will stop here. I believe I'm at about 20 minutes or so and open it up for questions.
Very good, Professor Herbert. Can you hear me? This is John DeVries from the Land Economics Foundation. First of all, on behalf of the foundation, we're very pleased to have supported this research and are very happy with your ability to adapt it to, you kind of have become a case study. You've really become kind of a case study and adaptation to the COVID, as well as the subject matter of your research. So congratulations on that. We do have some questions coming in. The first one was, how does the TAD differ from TIF, the Tax Increment Financing District?
They don't at all. It's just that in the TIF is tax increment financing, and in Atlanta it's just called Tax Allocation District. So it is absolutely the same method. In Georgia, we called it district just because if you look at these, it's considered that the blue corridor is the district. So it's just the name. There is no difference in the mechanism or the theoretical concept behind the name.
Very good. And we did have a second question come in fairly early in the talk, and that was, what do you mean, or could you talk a little more about spatial inequalities? And I assume this has some relationship to the extensive color of law discussion from the Rothstein book that's been going on in the LAI webinars this spring for a lot of the attendees today who have followed that. But can you talk a little bit about spatial inequalities and particularly what it might have meant as you used it in your research?
Yeah, so what we looked in I think an easy way to explain this to some degree is if you think about walk scores. When people look at how they walk from their home to an amenity or a service, they often think about how close or far are they from a good school, from a park, from a grocery store. And we are saying that there is a difference if you are close from a school versus close to or how far apart from a good school. How close are you to a grocery store that offers a variety of produce versus how close are you to a food mart that offers low quality food. So the difference became in not just access to services, but the quality of services. So for us, the spatial inequality was really this measure of people who live in the community where they have low access to quality opportunities, schooling, education, and amenities. And I think we found out that in most cases, housing became I don't want to say an answer, but housing really affects inequality in the sense that differences in house prices across the neighborhoods limit where the poor people or poor households can live. So the higher demand that we see in the more desirable neighborhoods pushes the prices in these locations even higher up. And without specific plan to bring more of a affordable housing in those neighborhoods, they become exclusive to only upper income communities. I have to say that in terms of Atlanta, there have been a number of efforts to address this issue. For example, a local chapter hosted a talk by representatives from West Side Futures Fund. And that is an organization whose main goal actually is to keep people from the community live in place even after development of the BeltLine. One of the tools that they're using is for them to actually help pay for increases in tax bills to residents who were in the community before the value of the property went up. And they are also providing a workforce housing and building those type of units in the communities that are subject to strong gentrification and potential displacement. So again, to us, the issue of spatial inequalities became defined as not just access to services, but access to high quality services, the type of services that we would see in upper income communities. I hope that helps answer the question.
That does very much. Jeff Beal has written in a couple of questions and comments and raised his hand also to ask a question. I'm wondering if we could just put Jeff on, unmute him for a second and let him, Jeff, if you can kind of summarize some of your questions and observations in a brief way, that would be helpful, I think, to everyone on the broadcast.
Sure, I appreciate you calling on me. I'm going back to your example of the Tyler Perry Studios. To me, it's only logical that when you introduce a major employer into an area, you create additional demand for housing and therefore real estate values go up. So using your logic, if you create value, it drives up land values, then you're entitled to participate in that increase in value. So following that logic, any employer or development that goes into an area and has a positive impact on land values would be entitled to capture some of that value. Why just is the government capturing the value? So that's my first point. My second question is, the reason you don't have high quality services in these areas is because you don't have significant purchasing power. I don't understand how you're going to overcome that obstacle. You're not going to get, well, you don't know the store, but let's use Starbucks as an example. You're not going to get Starbucks where people pay $5 for a cup of coffee as opposed to 7-Eleven where they pay $2 if you don't have the purchasing power. So I don't know how you're going to ever deal with that without dealing with elevating people's incomes and purchasing power. And my last point has to do with the flip side of gentrification that nobody wants to talk about. When an area gentrifies, that means property values are going up. And the people whose property values are going up are the very minority homeowners that you're, or property owners that you're looking to help. And by thwarting gentrification, basically you're keeping these people from capitalizing on their investment in their own property. So those are my comments and questions.
Thank you. And I do want to say that my point bringing up the Tyler Perry studios or film production studios into this discussion was exactly that, to say that there are development projects that create land value increases. And so criticizing one form of development that is financed through just because the model is or tool is called land value capture mechanism, but not pointing out the same kind of effects that different type of mechanism also creates, is to really shed light on that there are a number of ways where this is going to be true regardless of which mechanism we use. And I think it was mostly as a result of a discussion from the stakeholders that there is illiteracy between the community members about what these models actually are. And the word land value capture makes everybody feel that they should be able to receive those benefits directly. So I think that was to your point, and to maybe clarify some more of why the research turned in the other direction. In terms of spatial inequalities, I don't think this is something that I myself or a number of other researchers I've been working with will solve easily. I think it's a question of how we can or what could be done to probably mitigate some of the negative impacts that we see from these type of situations or outcomes and policies.
Good. Professor Herbert, we're getting a lot of questions, so I'm going to kind of keep moving things forward. A quick one for you, though, is could you revisit what is included in the BeltLine project? Is it exclusively a pedestrian cyclist green space, or does it also include a light rail component? This is from Richard Cook. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically the BeltLine used these old railroad tracks. It put a walk path just like these, and around the walk path you can see now developments of parks, green space. There is a brewery tour now. You can go through. Old warehouse spaces have been developed into residential lots. So the half-a-mile corridor includes all of that. It is I really want to say 22-mile mixed-use development district.
Very good, thank you. We have another question from Carl Sherrill. How shall and how can future lower cost, high-speed internet impact the fundamental thinking here? I think that must be related primarily to extending high speed and broadband to some of the impacted neighborhoods.
So I think this is all very urban, and I want to believe that there is access to high-speed internet. Now, the question of high-speed access is a very different one, and I think Microsoft has done some research to show that FCC data that shows broadband availability is present by no means means that broadband access is equal. Using the broadband and being able to afford it is a very different question to being able to access it. So having the network in your area. I want to say, although I'm not an expert on broadband research, but I believe that the difference there would be mostly between urban and rural communities. And I think that there is a lot of good research on how to mitigate that differential. But I would have to defer on that question to somebody who has done some more research on the access to broadband. Probably more studies will be coming out of the role the gap in the access is going to play now, even post-pandemic, since a lot of services are going virtual.
Very good, thank you. We also have a comment and implied question from Kathleen King. And she comments that she has seen or heard of lots of positive impacts from using TIF, particularly in California, to redevelop and increase value in commercial areas. But it is of great interest to hear about the, actually, they are also being used to bring benefits to residential areas. And yeah, do you want to comment a little bit about the applicability of these mechanisms to commercial, extending them more to residential, as well as historically? I know there's been a lot of use of these in industrial corridors.
Yeah, and I think I actually am not super familiar with the similar research done in, because I think New York, as well as the several cities on the West Coast, have used some, I'm so sorry, my email keeps popping up, have used these type of mechanisms. I'm not too familiar with it. I do know that, for example, in Georgia, aside from the new residential units, there has been over 500,000 of new non-residential square feet of space added along the same corridor. So I think the impact on the commercial side will be just as significant as it is on the residential side. We really wanted to consider those more closely in the two other cases in England and China. And since both of those developments are in more of a commercial district, the BeltLine is the BeltLine, I believe, is the largest urban redevelopment project in the US currently. So the sheer size of it makes it a little bit more difficult to focus on one area. It is a city-wide initiative.
Very good. We have a comment also from Rachel Eds, who happens to be the president of the LAF board. So you got to pay attention to this one now. Here you go. In your look at the public benefits from the studio development, you seem to have focused on or considered primarily the property value increases and the tax generated from that. She asked, jobs and income tax generated may also be a benefit of the studios. Would that be also something to have been considered, or did you consider it in your research or have time to consider it?
I have not in this particular study. However, there are several papers that I can send references to that have specifically looked at the changes in the employment and other factors in Atlanta area due to film studios, and they find no significant change. Now, caveat again, this is a relatively new program for Georgia. So I expect that even some of these employment multipliers and economic impact will be present maybe later in the future. I'm trying to see if I actually have some information here on the act itself, but it's a fairly new change, new program in Atlanta, last 10 years or so. But I have not. There are a couple of researchers from actually Kennesaw State Universities have specifically looked at Atlanta and found no significant change in the employment.
Very good. Going back to the chart that you are using to demonstrate the range of the different kinds of capture mechanisms, do you have any comments either from this research or from other research you're familiar with of these 15 or 20 different tools that could be used, which has been by far the most economic effective development tool that you've noticed in this research? And is there a wide range of success rates in applying some of these different tools?
I have not studied specifically any other tools. And as Richard and I were getting ready for this project, we reviewed the literature on these tools. What we found was that most large-scale projects use more than one simultaneously. And so it sometimes becomes very difficult to separate the effects of each of the tools independently. But in my own experience, in my own research, I haven't used or examined any of the other ones in enough detail to comment on that.
Those are all the questions we've received to date. Were there some things I know I had some limitations given the time we had today to kind of make you constrict all this to 20 minutes. Were there some other topics or things you might have commented on if we had had a little more time today?
Well, some of the comments really would have been more about the efforts that Atlanta has gone through to address some of the concerns that came up once the project started. And I want to say that I'm quite happy with the work that has been done to create governing body for this project, as well as the oversight of the project. So I think that probably would have been something to emphasize, that by no means that this should be viewed as a criticism of the existing project, more of challenges that policymakers and stakeholders face as they get involved with this scale of project. But the Atlanta project or BeltLine has created something that they called Tax Allocation District Advisory Committee. And the committee has done a really good work to advise on how the funds ought to be used. So again, some of it was done beforehand, some of it along the, as they started receiving criticism of the project. So I imagine that it's always easy to look back and see this could have been done better, or this should have been done better. But in essence, these projects take years to plan, start, manage. BeltLine started before housing market crash that not many predicted. And so there were hiccups on the road that needed to be addressed. So I probably didn't emphasize enough that there was a lot of work done to mitigate some of these concerns.
Very good. And we did have one more question coming in, and that was, is there some displacement that you noticed in your research on the BeltLine? I know that you were limited in being able to do some of your normal field research. And I guess a related question is, are these fiscal impacts on residents impacting renters more than owners? And is there any tool for using property tax deferrals on either the city or the state level to help people be able to stay in those areas once these values start rising, as you've documented?
Right. So actually, I think the answer is yes to all of those questions. There has been a lot of displacement along the BeltLine corridor. I think, and some of it because the property was dilapidated, and as the property was redeveloped, of course, the newer, better units were more expensive, and so they were only attractive to or affordable to higher income people, and so lower income people could not even compete to return to these areas. I think there was no provisions for how to deal with escalating tax bills for low-income homeowners who were originally in the neighborhood. Later on, the agencies came out that the main aim was to deal with that issues. As I mentioned, the West Side Future Fund is one of those agencies. There was no plan for how to address increasing rents when the BeltLine project was originally designed. And I do believe that the rental market suffered probably more so than homeowners did. Rental market, I would imagine that there was a lot more displacement in that segment in a way than home ownership. I have not myself done a look at the particular numbers. A graduate student of mine has examined the displacement and gentrification along the corridor and worked on identifying a specific spatial units in terms of census tracts and block groups that were more that were affected more by displacement
Okay,
than others.
very,
So there is research out there on that. Yes,
Very good,
I
very
did
good.
not look at it myself.
unfortunately, we're getting close to the end of our time, but we're going to squeeze in one more question here from Joseph Consoli. And he's asking, and this question may apply more to at the early stages of the BeltLine project, but is how did market analysis play into the establishment of the property uses within the district, particularly around the transit stops? And if you're familiar with how communities are identifying uses around these TOD sites, more generally, you could comment on that as well.
For this specific project, I really don't know. We didn't really examine that information. So I would try not to say more than that. I was not, I didn't review any of the programs or proposals. I know at one point there was an overlay zoning discussion, the zoning that would be overlaid to the existing zoning layer. But I think that wouldn't have impacted any residential, existing residential or high density residential zones. However, I want to say I did not, while I'm aware that some of it was done, I'm not, I don't have enough knowledge to discuss it at this minute. I would need to review the material much more before saying more.
Okay, well, thank you. I will turn the program now back over to our moderator, Richard Cook. I think the number of questions and the depth of them suggests that there's a lot more that can be done in this area, and you've provoked our members to be thinking about this in a lot more depth, I think, than a lot of us had on the use of these funding districts. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm very appreciative of being a part of the organization, being funded, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the project.
Thank you, John, for moderating, and Velma, a great presentation, a really interesting project. And I think that evolved as a lot of things have in the last couple of years. And certainly if you go forward, we'd look forward to you looking, you and your colleagues looking at Vancouver or Toronto's experience in value capture, where I would say most of it is done by the municipalities, and they look at things like 75% of the uplift of on the land value as a contribution from developers to projects that are in and around major transportation investments. So I think it's a very different world in different places, and it's I think good to compare, which is I think what you were trying to achieve. I want to remind everyone that the webinar is actually being recorded. And so if you or your colleagues want to see it again, it will be available online on LAI YouTube. Velma, it looks like you might be a bit surprised by that. But anyway, you've done a great job on it. And just to remind you that we will have a series of webinars throughout the year. And starting in October, we will be announcing something on that very shortly. Sheila, do you want to make a couple of final comments?
My only final comment is, Velma, I think when Atlanta did the LU, they presented the very, very beginnings of this project. And I just remember it very distinctly. So those of you that go to LUs, now you can see what happens when you get somebody in there that does additional research. It's so amazing, the interconnectivity we're experiencing here. So once again, thanks to everybody. Thank you, John. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Rick. Thank all of you for attending. And thank you, Velma, for your great work. And we look forward to hearing from you, not only in future research projects, but maybe as a Memphis member too.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all. I hope everybody has a wonderful Friday and the weekend.
Great. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.